How's it going, everybody, and welcome back to another video with the Roshank Redemption. In today's video, I wanted to share my impressions on Mass Effect Andromeda, and talk a little bit first of all on whether or not I think the game is worth buying, and second of all, whether or not it lives up to the Mass Effect legacy. But before I get into specifics on that, I do want to clarify that this is not really a full review, and I wouldn't say it represents my finalized thoughts on the game. And the only reason why I'm saying this is the game has only been out for a few days, and I do want a little bit of time for the dust to settle and for me to play the game a little bit more before I say that these are my finalized thoughts. So just keep that in mind when watching the video. Anyways, let me first give you a TLDR version, and then I'll try to go a little bit more in depth with my thoughts. My verdict on this game is I cannot recommend buying it right now, and let me give you my reasons for this from two perspectives. On the one hand, if you've never played a Mass Effect game and if you're new to the franchise, I would say go and play the original trilogy first, because those are some of the greatest games of all time, especially Mass Effect 2. On the other hand, if you're a hardcore fan, I'm still afraid to recommend the game, simply because I feel like Mass Effect Andromeda is a shadow of the original trilogy in most aspects, so I feel like you'll just be disappointed with the game. So regardless of what background you're coming from, my recommendation is to not buy this game, at least not yet. As someone who considers himself to be a fairly big Mass Effect fan, this is something that I really hate to say, and I really did want this game to succeed, but I feel like it hasn't for the most part. And maybe it is a little bit unfair of me to compare it to the original trilogy, but that is the standard that I want to hold it to, personally, because it is a Mass Effect game. As a standalone game, you could argue that it's not too bad, and if you really want to go for it and buy it right now or wait for the price to go down a little bit and then pick it up, then go ahead and do that. But in terms of whether it lives up to the legacy of Mass Effect, I would definitely have to say not quite. So let's go ahead and go a little bit more in depth on the game. I want to start off by talking about graphics, and for me, anything not pertaining to the facial animation and the character movement, and specifically the scenery, was actually quite good, and I really enjoyed everything non-facial animation related for the most part. But unfortunately, the facial animation and character movement are pretty much as bad as the entire internet has been saying. I don't really want to dwell on this too much though, simply because it has been talked about a lot already, and it was a problem in the first 3 games as well. So for the most part, I was actually able to look past this, and this isn't my main issue with the game. On a similar note, there are quite a few bugs and relatively minor glitches in the game, but the original trilogy did have its share of those as well, so for the most part, I was able to look past it. Next, let's talk about lore and world building, and for me personally, this is the most important thing in a game. Now, there's definitely potential when it comes to the lore, but I really feel like the game did an awful job capitalizing and executing when it came to the lore. The Kett and especially the Remnant are really interesting conceptually, but they just did a terrible job exploring the lore and bringing it to the forefront of the game. I'm just not nearly as interested in the Kett as I was the Reapers and all the other races of the first 3 games. Like I said, there's tons of potential here, but it just all feels wasted, and this is one example of the game being a shadow of Mass Effect 1, 2, and 3. The next topic I want to discuss is exploration, and this is actually something that I thought was quite good. There's definitely a lot to explore in the game, and if you're talking pure amount of things to see and do, this game will give you a lot of content, on the order of 60 to 100 hours. Unfortunately though, the problem isn't the amount of content, it's the depth of the content, and this is something that open world games today seem to not be able to get right for the most part. As an aside, I realize that Mass Effect Andromeda is technically not an open world game, but it does have quite a few open world elements, so even though BioWare says it's not open world, it kind of is. Regardless, let's go ahead and move on to quests, and that issue I was talking about earlier, with the depth of the game not being there, is really brought out in the quests. There are a ton of quests to do in this game, but it just feels like a lot of the quests are super tedious, and a lot of the things I was doing during the quests, like a lot of the annoying puzzles for example, were busy work, and that's not how I want to feel when I'm playing a game. I want something like The Witcher 3, where when you're doing the quests, for the most part they're all enjoyable. And I wouldn't say that all the quests were bad. There were definitely a couple of quests that I really enjoyed and I felt like had the depth, but for the most part, the vast majority of quests and the vast amount of hours that you have in this game are just not deep enough. The best metaphor I can think of, which has been brought up hundreds of times, is the game is as wide as an ocean but about as deep as a puddle. The next issue I'd like to address is the characters, and I would argue that this is the most important part of a Mass Effect game. Unfortunately, once again, the characters are a shadow of the original trilogy. I wouldn't say the characters are quite as bad as the depth of content or the lore and world building, but they're just not as good as the original trilogy. Let's take Ryder for example. Ryder is actually a decent protagonist. He's not a bad character, and he does an okay job driving the story, but he just doesn't compare to Shepard and isn't as iconic as Shepard was. There also just isn't a single crewmate that's quite on the level as some of our most beloved from Mass Effect 1, 2, and 3, like Garrus, Rex, Liara, Tali, and so on. And for the most part, the lack of likable characters, at least as likable as the original trilogy, is the biggest reason why this game fails in comparison to the original trilogy. Similarly, I didn't find the story to be as interesting as the previous games, and specifically here, the Reapers brought an element of horror and a sense of hopelessness, and when you were fighting the Reapers, you felt like you were embroiled in this massive galactic conflict. On the other hand, Andromeda is first of all full of hope, and I guess that's more of a personal thing. I prefer the hopelessness of the conflict of the Reapers, but also the conflict definitely didn't feel as big, and I do feel like that takes away from the enjoyability of the story. You could argue that this is more of a personal thing, so I guess I'll say that the story wasn't too bad, but I still feel like it wasn't as big and all-encompassing as in Mass Effect 1 through 3. The last topic I want to address is combat, and combat is actually quite excellent in this game. I would definitely say it's vastly improved for the most part from the previous games. The best term I can use to describe the new skill and character progression system is flexible. It feels like there's a lot more that you can do in this game. So combat they really nailed, and that's a very good part of this game. So if there is one reason to pick up this game, and if there's one thing that this game does better than the previous Mass Effect games, it's the combat. Once again guys, I can't overall recommend that you buy this game simply because it struggled in too many aspects. It's by no means a terrible game like a lot of people are saying. It's a decent game, it just didn't quite live up to the reputation of Mass Effect, and I would recommend waiting for the price to drop a little bit before picking it up. Thanks so much for watching guys. Be sure to let me know if you want to see a full review of the game at some point, and if you want to hear my finalized thoughts when I do end up finalizing my thoughts and getting through the game fully, and I will see you in my next video.